So I'll jump in here. I'm Paul Nemecek. I started at Spring Arbor University 35 years ago, which doesn't seem possible now. And I'm now director of SAU Guatemala. 2.5 years ago, my wife and I moved to Guatemala to run our semester abroad program there. And I see a lot of friendly faces here who have visited us down in Guatemala for a semester. Topic today is work, wages, and wealth. And I'm going to jump in. I often tell people I like to teach by starting fights. And hopefully it'll be a polite discussion. Come, let us reason together. But my goal is to throw out a few things that will get us going on a conversation. There's been much in the news about income inequality or Pope Francis' speech on unfettered capitalism and that kind of thing. So we want to have a conversation about what justice is. You may remember that if you were in chapel on Monday, I quoted Socrates, who asked Thrasymachus, "What is justice?" And Thrasymachus replied, "Justice is the interest of the stronger," which is kind of like an early version of the perversion of the golden rule, he who makes the gold rules. And we'll see if that's how accurate that might be. Some of the key questions I want to ask for us to discuss: what are the options for distribution of rewards? When there's a shared task, how do you decide who gets how much? How can we measure inequality? And that's something us sociologists spend a lot of time doing. What does inequality look like in historical and international perspective? And so if we look at the U.S. Historically, I've got some graphs and charts that hopefully won't bore you to tears. What is a just distribution of rewards? And this is the toughest question we're going to encounter. To come up with some sense of what counts as a fair wage or a just wage is not an easy question to address, and that's where we'll probably have our debates. And then what might we do to create a more just society are some of the key questions we're going to ask. Starting in, social psychologists talk about if you have a group task, there are 4 basic options for distribution of rewards in a group task. One of those is to distribute things on the basis of need. Whoever needs the most gets the most kind of thing. Another option is equality. We share the task. Let's say 10 of us are going to do a shared task. Let's say maybe shoveling snow. There should be some opportunities for that right now. Not where I live in Antigua, Guatemala, but here, lots of opportunities for shoveling snow. So 10 of us shovel snow and we collectively get paid $100, and so equality would say $10 per person. Equity, on the other hand, is where rewards are proportionate to efforts. And so if Kyle shovels twice as hard as Kaylee, he should get twice as much because Kaylee was slacking, right? Something like that. And so we'd look at how much effort people put in, adjust things accordingly. The last option, self-interest. So let's say we put one person in charge, we put Ethan in charge of the team, and he says, okay, we get paid $100, but I was the boss, so I get 50, and the rest of you can divide up. I'd say 55 would be easier, because then you have 9 people left, $5 a piece, something like that. Not that Ethan would do that, but that would be one option. And so these are the different ways we can talk about shared rewards. And when we talk about work, we're talking about shared efforts. There are investors, capitalists as such, that contribute money and resources, owners, workers, all of whom work at producing goods and services. But the question about who should get how much is a pretty critical question, and how we make that decision about who gets how much is a pretty important question, and that's what we're going to try to address here. One of the ways we measure inequality is something called a Gini coefficient. And this is a number ranging from 0 to 1. 0 represents a score where every person has exactly the same income. And as you probably guess, there's no such place on the face of the earth. A 1 represents a society wherein one person has everything and everybody else has nothing in terms of income. And as you might guess, this place also doesn't exist anywhere on the face of the earth. So they're hypothetical endpoints, and we can arrange societies on a continuum between 0 and 1. Complete inequality, total, or complete equality, total inequality as our 2 endpoints. Any questions on that? Does the model make sense? This 0 to 1. Okay. This is Gini coefficients for different countries in the world, so this kind of puts things on as we do kind of an international comparison, and you'll see the U.S. is right there, and this is looking at, you'll see Iceland, Slovenia, Norway, Denmark, Czech Republic, Finland, all tend to be about 0.25, and they're the countries globally that have the lowest levels of inequality. At the right end of the graph, Chile, Mexico, Turkey, and then the United States, higher levels of inequality overall. Let me just see if there are any questions on that graph before I...
What is the OECD?
OECD is the Organization of Economically Developed, that's not the exact title, but it's a list of, I think, 34 countries that are more economically developed. Yes?
Why aren't there any African nations?
Because there aren't that many economically developed African nations, and they're not part of the OECD. But African nations have fairly high, the highest is, I think, Senegal, if I remember right, at 0.66. Guatemala, who's also not on the list, is 0.57. And actually, I'll show a couple here, other samples of Gini coefficients. This is just a selected sample, and you see the first three, the Scandinavian countries, 0.24, 0.25, 0.26, and Finland comes in at 0.27. Austria, the Czech Republic, Japan's also in that same range of relatively low inequality. And then when you get to the other end, the Seychelles Islands, Namibia, South Africa, 0.63, 0.64, 0.66, Guatemala at 0.56, and the U.S. at 0.5. So if we do international comparisons, the U.S. has a relatively high level of economic income inequality. And I should clarify, they use Gini coefficients to measure income or to measure wealth distribution. There's two different, and income is what you receive through interest, work, etc. Wealth is accumulated assets and so forth. And this is income, so this is looking at income in particular. Other questions on this? Okay. This is looking at it in historical perspective. This is specifically in the U.S., and this is since 1979. And I'll talk about why we're doing since 1979 a bit later. So they're using kind of a convergence point in 1979 of productivity, average income of the top 1%, average overall wages. And so the green line represents kind of the slope of productivity. The blue line represents average overall wages, which is relatively flat, a little bit of increase since 1979, and the top 1%, and we've heard quite a bit about the 1%, much, much higher in relation to productivity, which is one way of saying in the last roughly 35 years, income inequality has increased in terms of in relation to productivity, wages, and so forth. There's a couple different ways of looking at this, and I'll get to those, and then we'll see what kinds of questions that produces. This is another one showing the top 1%, and then by quintiles, dividing into fifths, the top 20%, bottom 20%, and so forth, again since 1979. And then the graph on the right is showing the change in share of income. Has it increased? Has it decreased? And you can see for the bottom four here, actually in inflation-adjusted dollars, income has decreased while it's gone up pretty significantly for the top 1% or the top 20% overall. This is showing in a much larger historical perspective. So we're going all the way back to, I think, 1913 at the beginning here. And this is just showing inequality and income concentration at the top and how it's changed over time. You see two really big peaks there. One of those much more recent, around 2007, 2008, right before it takes a nosedive. 2007, 2008 is kind of our economic meltdown. Can anyone, what's the date of the other peak where income concentration was really, really high? About what year are we talking about? 1927, 28, in that range. Anything significant happened right after that? 1929 is the Black Tuesday, the stock market crash, and the Great Depression and so forth. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily we're heading in that direction, but that's the last time we had the level of economic concentration at the top that we currently have. And that's not the only factor that went into the Great Depression, but it's maybe a little worthy of looking at. Some of the income gains, and this, again, this is going from 1950, and one of the things they're pointing out here is that when you show the 95th percentile or the median or the 20th percentile, and again, it's looking at gains from about 1950 on up close to about 1979 or 1980, the date we've been looking at, everybody benefited. You may have heard the phrase rising tide lifts all boats. That was relatively true in that period from 1950 up until about 1980. Not as true since then. One person quipped, more recently, the rising tide lifts all yachts. Not all boats, just the yachts. And there's some, again, the evidence to suggest that, those at the 20th percentile not doing nearly as well. And I want to show a video here, if we can. This, just by way of introductions, this is Chuck Collins. Let me make sure the audio's up. And he's kind of illustrating and commenting on maybe how this happened, why it happened, and what the consequences are. We had Chuck Collins here in, I think, 2010 as one of our keynote speakers for our focus series called Just Economics. He's the great-grandson of Oscar Mayer, the hot dog guy. When he turned 25, he inherited $500,000 and gave it all away because he decided he didn't earn it, so why should he keep it? And he's now a senior analyst and has a master's degree in economic development. So he's talking a little bit about this change over time.
Let's take a closer look at the trends of the last 3 decades. To illustrate this, I've asked several members of the Common Security Club here in Boston to help me make a human graph. Imagine that we've lined up everyone in the United States, from the lowest income person to the highest income person, and divided them into 5 equal-sized groups, or quintiles. So each person here represents about 22 million households. The bottom fifth are households with incomes under $27,000. The next fifth, the second fifth, are household incomes of between $27,000 and $47,000. The middle fifth, household incomes from $47,000 to $71,000. The next fifth, household incomes $71,000 to $109,000. And the top fifth, household incomes over $109,000.
Minimum wage job. I mean, if one adult working at minimum wage job, if you have just one child, you're under poverty. And 45% of poor families have an adult who's, or a family member, I should say, who's working 40 hours a week. And the image people often have of the poor is kind of, you know, the welfare poor who just sit at home collecting checks. But it's not accurate. Almost half have a family member who works full-time, but the wages aren't sufficient to put them above the poverty line for the most part. And so some of these in these other categories are people who are trying to get a little more work just to get above that line. If you have kids and your second job is minimum wage, probably 75% may go to child care and things like that, and that's part of the struggle. But I think that's where a lot of the older people end up working minimum wage jobs. Yes?
I've heard an argument against raising the minimum wage that if, like, the cost for everything else will go up, so it really wouldn't change a whole lot. Is there like any accuracy to that?
There can be some. And that's the 600 economists who just signed a thing saying it would be good for the economy to raise minimum wage. Again, 7 Nobel Prize winners. They're saying there might be modest inflationary effect, but the effect of increased demand will offset that. And so on the whole, they're saying it would be good. And they're not just saying it because they pulled it out of thin air. There have been a number of studies done in the last decade For example, 2006 is the last time we passed a bill that raised the minimum wage, and they studied the effects of that pretty extensively and said it did not have the effect that past economic theorists would suggest. And same with the 1996 increase in minimum wage. Number of different studies done, they said it does not necessarily. They're careful to say it can have. And so the conditions have to be right, but when they're saying when you're in a recession trying to stave off a depression, it could actually be very productive for the economy if we raise minimum wage, and therefore put more discretionary income in the hands of people who are going to go out and spend it rather than play in the casino economy kind of thing. And it's the opposite. Supply-side economics basically says cut taxes, put more money at the top, those people will create businesses which will stimulate the economy, but that's essentially what the last 30 plus years have been an experiment in, and I'm thinking the verdict is not good. Yes?
Can you go back and explain collective bargaining?
Yeah, collective bargaining, they just have laws that say you must sit down at the table with employees and people are forced to negotiate. And so it's like mandating a union in some ways and saying, what's that?
What is the difference between that and
It's similar. The worker co-determination saying who must be on the board. And so theoretically in Sweden, you could still have all stockholders on the board, but they're required to sit down with the employees and say, let's talk about what a fair wage is. And just, for example, in the Czech Republic, this economist friend of mine, I was talking to him, and he was telling me about his wife had just had a baby, and they get 3 years paid maternity leave. And if they want, they can take 4 years with reduced pay or 2 years with increased pay, and that's one of the benefits there. We're one of 6 countries in the world that does not have a federally mandated paid maternity leave. And the others are Liberia, Swaziland, Papua New Guinea, and I forget the other 2. But we're not in great company there is part of what I'm saying. And so when you look at, and one of the things that people have to ask, there's a lot of concern about the amount we pay in taxes. One important question is what do you get for what you pay in taxes? And that's often, if you just look at the tax rates, that's one piece of the picture. The Scandinavian countries we're talking about pay more in taxes. In Denmark, university education is free up through the PhD if you do well enough in school, and you get a stipend of $723 a month to cover living expenses. Kind of similar to here, right? Not so much. And so people pay more in taxes, but it's a country that says education's an investment in our future. And so it's a worthwhile investment to invest in the future of the country and things like that. In Denmark, broadband cable is a human right. And so you get, my point is simply that you get something for what you're paying. And most of those countries have national health care and some other things like that. Yes, Kaylee.
talking about like unfair capitalism. What kind of fetters do we need without people freaking out that we're slipping into socialism?
Yeah, I mean, because you hear that term thrown around all the time. Technically, socialism is when the government owns and controls the means of production. Harper's had an article a while ago that said in the U.S., the government owns 0.5% of the means of production, which puts us a little ways away from socialism at this point. And in reality, kind of like the Gini coefficient, where the endpoints are theoretical models, there's no pure capitalist country on the face of the earth, and there's no purely socialist country on the face of the earth. It's where are we in between the two endpoints? When I teach social stratification, I use a text by Harold Kerbo who says, we're asking the wrong question when we talk about capitalism versus socialism. Capitalism won. I mean, you're talking about North Korea and Cuba or something like that, but other than that, capitalism won. So the question is not capitalism or socialism, but what kind of capitalism do we want? And he essentially says the US, England, and Canada have one version. Western Europe has another version. Asia has yet another version. And since then, do you know what the BRICS countries are? Russia, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. The emerging markets may end up with yet a fourth model of capitalism. But that's the question we should be asking, I think, is what should capitalism look like? And who should benefit and how? And that kind of thing. And I think that's where persons of faith need to have voice. There was a question in the back, and I keep meaning to get to you. Yes?
I was going to ask, with all of this inflation and the stuff with the 1% in the Western countries, how does that affect the social injustices that are increasing throughout the world, like human trafficking and slavery and stuff?
Great question. And I would argue greatly, because we are, if you look at Economist magazine, which I get on my iPad every week, look at trade surpluses and trade deficits, and there's no country in the world that comes close to our trade deficit. And what that means is we're importing a whole lot more than we're exporting. China has a huge trade surplus, exporting more than they're importing. What that means is the rest of the world depends heavily on us as the consumer economy, as the ones who will consume the goods. And part of what that means is when we had our economic meltdown in 2007, 2008, there's a ripple effect across the globe, because we're not consuming as much, they're laying off people, their tax base decreases because there's less wages to tax, and so countries like Greece and Spain and so forth are on the verge of meltdown because of this kind of global economic crisis. And so a simple shift in our economic conditions affects the entire globe. In a country like where I live, Guatemala, it's a huge effect. Our two top sources of foreign earnings are remittances, people who live here sending money to Guatemala, and tourism. We get a downturn, and Guatemala suffers pretty greatly. Bruce. Dr. Brown.
My question may sound a little bit like a sermon or a statement, but I've thought many times that capitalism is actually the perfect system, provided that all the agents are people that have a moral foundation, a moral compass. And it seems to me that if the people that are operating the levers of it are willing to be amoral or immoral, then it's really dangerous. And I guess one of the things that concerns me is the way in which Christians have been more and more willing to accept a narrative that's really amoral at best, because they use money as the judge of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think I'm fair?
No, I think you're right on. And I think, I mean, if you look at the Old Testament prophets, they railed about economic injustice. And that's a dominant theme from Genesis to Revelation in Scripture. The rich and the poor shows up a great deal. And that's not something that the church has been very vocal about. I mean, we like charity, but justice, where we demand more just systems, is not as much on our, that's more difficult, more to achieve, and so we don't mess with it very much.
Do you think we're using money as the judge of all things, and that is the definition of what the Bible speaks about, of not living by the Spirit, but living by using the money as the judge of all things?
Well, go to church this Sunday and see what they put in the bulletin as a measure of success. And I'm predicting, most churches at least, will have last week's attendance and last week's offering. And when John the Baptist sent his disciples to Jesus, "Are you the one we're looking for? Shall we seek another?" Tell them that the blind see, the lame walk, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. In other words, a different evaluation of outcomes of success, kind of thing. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Going off what you said about charity, you know, they're discovering now, and even just went to a seminar this morning about it, that sometimes our charitable efforts, especially from the States and Europe, are actually harming other countries and harming their economy.
Yeah.
So how would we move, or at least in your opinion, how would we move from just charity to actually stopping injustice and making change?
Yeah. Martin Luther King years ago said, "The judgment of God is upon America for its failure to be true to its prophetic mission. The church must recapture its prophetic zeal, or it will become a social club without spiritual or moral authority." And again, when we talk about prophetic zeal, and look at what the Old Testament prophets did, they were yelling at the powers that be for their treatment of the poor. Things like, "You sell the needy for a pair of sandals," "A farmer plants his field and injustice sweeps it away." Read through Proverbs, Amos, it's all over the place as a dominant theme in Scripture, and it's a dominant theme that evangelical churches don't talk about very much. Or am I wrong? Maybe I've been out of the country too long, and I'd love to hear that I'm wrong about that, but
Are we just ignorant to the harm we're doing because we want to think we're doing something good?
I think that's part of it. And actually, the more poor people we have to go around, the better I can feel about myself. I mean, charity is about, when I do charity, I always have to ask, is this about me or is it about them? And sometimes it's, hey, I can, toss a coin here or there, and I go away feeling a whole lot better, and their life hasn't changed one bit, except maybe they'll get a snack or something like that. And most people would prefer to earn their own way. A society that allows people the dignity of work and just compensation for work so that they can pay their own way. But creating a just society is a lot more work. 4 times I've been in D.C. on Capitol Hill lobbying on poverty issues and wage issues and things like that, with taking students there. We meet with senators and representatives. But there's a whole lot more lobbyists for the other side, if you will, who are arguing for a different way of thinking about the economy. And so it is really difficult work. And I don't want to be too hard on charity. I always say there's plenty of poverty to go around. We don't have to fight over it. In terms of charity versus justice, by all means, keep doing charity, but I think the church needs to become a voice for justice and a more just society and fair treatment of not just the poor, but the working person. Who may not be poor but is not getting a decent wage or a living wage. Got a few minutes left. What other kinds of questions? Or yes?
I guess I don't fully understand how exactly our current economic system or those behind it are exploiting the poor. I know as Christians we are called over and over again to care for the poor. And there's got to be something wrong. I'm just not sure exactly what.
It goes back, in my mind, it goes back to a just wage. If I'm paying someone as little as I can possibly pay them, and if that person is desperate enough to take kind of the lowest wage I can pay, I would consider that exploitation.
So it's wage.
Wage is a big part of it, yeah. Just, again, 45% of poor households have a family member working full-time, but the wages aren't enough to pull them out of poverty. And that wasn't always the case. For much of my early years, one income was sufficient to care for a family of, in my case, 6. My father worked. The early years, my mother did not. And he was a pastor, not paid particularly well, but it was enough to get by. And that the economy has shifted in that regard. Another comment, question? Yes?
I was just curious, I know you mentioned a bunch of verses that say, don't exploit the poor. Does the Bible ever define, is it biblically defined what exploitation of the poor is?
I'm sorry, biblically defined as?
Does the Bible define, what exploitation of the poor is, or is that left up to our interpretation?
Yeah, there are some things that hint at it, like in the sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee. There's a verse in Proverbs that says if someone if an alien your fellow countryman becomes poor, take care of him just as you would an alien, which wouldn't work well in our culture, I don't think. But the idea is there's just an obligation to make sure that everybody has the minimum. Just my own sense, I think it's a national disgrace when you have children living in poverty. You can go to an adult and say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but when you're the richest nation on the face of the earth, to have the kind of poverty we have, I think, is a result of greed, and my biggest concern for the U.S. is a loss of commitment to the common good. The sense that I'm going to get mine, you're not my problem kind of thing. And so, yeah, to some extent it's left up to us to decide what it means to do justice. Yes?
Do you think a lot of the issue is the people with power, like in DC, are the ones that are a part of the top 5%, 10%?
Sure. No, yeah, and that's been the case for a long, long time. When you look at cabinet members, senators, and so forth, even for the last 100 years, the majority come from pretty, would be in inflation-adjusted dollars, millionaires. There was one candidate years ago that was presidential candidate who well, actually, he campaigned pretty much like I'm dressed now, blue jeans, plaid shirt, flannel shirt, and trying to suggest I'm one of you all, and somebody was being a bit of a smart aleck and shouted out, "What's it cost for a gallon of milk?" And he had to send an aide out to find out how much it cost for a gallon of milk, and the point was, if you don't know the price of a gallon of milk, you're not one of us, and let's stop kidding us, kind of thing. And so it is part of the problem that we get presented with a pretty narrow range of options in political discourse, and you have people who may be a tiny bit left of center and a tiny bit right of center. But I think to a large extent we live in a corporatocracy, that corporations have such influence that they kind of pick who we get to pick from, and so either way they win to some extent. Time for maybe one or two more questions or comments. Yes?
Going back to what Jamie said, what are some ways that we in this country, and especially the church, can lessen like that impact that we have on other countries, that detrimental impact of consuming everyday hurt from it, or to be charitable to them in ways that aren't going to hurt them and make us feel better?
And that's a big, big question. And I think it's a big question that demands small answers. And what I mean by that is part of the problem with the church taking on justice issues in relation to economics is that it's such a big problem we don't even want to touch it. It's much easier to point to other people's sins and other people's problems than to try to address something like this. And I think people have to find a place where they can plug in and recognize this is where the body of Christ imagery comes in that if we're trying to fix it by ourselves or even a small group and fix the whole thing, it's just too big. But finding little ways, whether it's support for legislation, advocacy on Capitol Hill, whether it's your church taking on local issues and things like that, it's a start. And it's not easy. And I think that's why we avoid it. One last question or comment. Hearing none, I'll move for adjournment. Thank you for coming, and hope your focus experience is great this year.